Kristen and Val from the NGO training program.
Hi everyone.
We're here today because we just attended a really interesting seminar about child development, and we essentially wanted to share with you a little bit of our thoughts on what we heard and what this could mean.
Yeah, and it's probably one of the rare times I really enjoyed numbers and statistics.
Yes.
But it was very impressive, and we just like to kind of give you a bit of an overview. And we managed to get some time in with Professor Carr, who's leading this amazing research.
But essentially, this study is based in New South Wales. It's looking at a cohort of 87,000 kids, so it's massive. It's kids who were 5 years of age in 2009, and this New South Wales Child Development Study is going to go for about 15 to 20 years, so it's a very interesting long-term study.
Yeah, and can I just add how impressed I was, because it's a research study that's actually got a whole group of 99.9% of all kindergarten children in New South Wales. That's pretty much all 5-year-olds in 2009
exactly.
are now part of this study for 20 years, and that is incredibly impressive to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so today's seminar with Professor Carr and his colleagues was looking at, I guess, their initial findings. So this cohort of 87,000 kids in 2009 completed the Australian Early Development Index, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that involved. And they were giving us their initial findings in relation to the outcomes of that index, but also with some data linkages that they'd done with a number of government agencies. So it was fascinating.
It didn't start that way, though, did it? Professor
No.
Carr initially had, I think, his own agenda and quite a very specific reason for doing the research, which was...
Yeah, that's right. He works at New South Wales Uni, doesn't he? And specifically in schizophrenia and epidemiology. And he was initially more interested in looking at the mental health of young kids. But as he started talking to more stakeholders, he realised that the study could be much more broad, and that there was a real opportunity to gather a lot of rich data to give a wonderful picture of the lives of these young children.
Yeah, and by stakeholders, we're talking about massive agencies and organizations.
Yeah.
You know, what better way than to kind of piece together a big puzzle that talks about children's health, education, their involvement with community services, or their criminal records, or those of their parents. It's quite impressive.
Yeah, it was massive. And I guess while we're talking about some of those parameters, it'd be good just to share with the listeners about the Australian Early Development Index, because all kids across Australia do this, but this study is looking at the New South Wales kids. But the domains that they do the survey on are emotional security, social competence, physical health and wellbeing, language skills and cognitive skills, and also communication and general knowledge. So it's quite broad ranging.
Yeah, it's broad domains, quite a lot of input that you can gather, and then when you link that up with other things, as we'll talk about, some really interesting findings come out.
Yeah, I mean, probably better for the listeners to have a look at that great animation that they showed us at the seminar around what is record linkage and how does that work, because they'll be able to explain it probably more succinctly than we can, but it's well worth having a look at. So we'll share that on the website.
Yeah, have a look, because it's good at highlighting how the information was kind of pulled together, and how well it's still maintained individuals' privacy and
yeah, just the confidentiality of the people involved, and that's the kids and the parents, because the data is drawn from all these different agencies on both the children and their parents.
Yeah.
But there were some really interesting findings, stuff that I just didn't even contemplate before going in. Like,
absolutely.
What were some of the ones for you?
Well, for me, it was the kids speaking a second language, and how they actually are less vulnerable than those who only speak English. And I just never even considered that factor.
No.
That would have an impact, either negatively or positively. I just didn't think about it. But
Absolutely. That's one of the beauties, I think, of these kind of studies, because it brings out information like that, like you said, you couldn't even begin to kind of hypothesize at the start.
Yeah, exactly. And there's more.
Yeah.
You tell me yours.
Well, one that surprised me was that 29% of the fathers of these 87,000 kids have a criminal record, and that's a reoffending criminal record.
I know. How high is that percentage?
Yeah.
Of all fathers of 5-year-olds.
Yes.
29% reoffenders.
So, I found that quite, I guess, shocking, surprising. Yeah, shocking and surprising.
You can't really go further than that and make assumptions, but it's just an interesting finding.
Yeah.
And also, when they were looking specifically at the family and community services data, in association, like they were trying to associate types of abuse with the vulnerabilities on that index.
Mm-hmm.
And what was striking to me was the consistency of one particular type of abuse, which is neglect, and then after that multiple abuses were incredibly high on the vulnerability scale, and that was consistent. And I think it's fair to say that neglect is probably the most quiet of abuses. It's the one that's not necessarily recognized and spoken about inside and outside of our field. So that was really interesting. Yes,
definitely, I agree. And another one for me was also that finding around mothers who smoke.
Yes, well, they highlighted that mothers who do smoke during pregnancy, their children at the age of 5 have greater social and emotional vulnerabilities. And the study was taking out other factors that may have contributed to these vulnerabilities, emotional and social. And still with those emissions, smoke, it was still incredibly high. So,
Yes, an interesting finding. One of the other things that was of interest to both of us was some of the discussion that was after the professor and his colleagues had shared their findings within the room, and people were talking about what they thought might be some possible future data linkages that could be included for this cohort that currently we're not drawing on. So what were some of those again?
They were talking about disability, of course,
that's
especially with all the changes that are happening, homelessness and housing, and how that could help.
Yeah.
And then
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, data around that group of people within the community. But they were mentioning at the time that they were experiencing some challenges in getting an Aboriginal reference group together.
The research team was,
Yeah, so they need to establish this first before they can start looking at that data.
Specifically, yeah. Overall, Professor Carr was quite clear, and his team, that this is still the beginning of this hugely long process. Already some really meaty, interesting information. I think what also participants like us got really excited about is the potential. So, it maps out all of the vulnerabilities and all of the factors that can contribute to that. But there was this feeling in the room that actually this study would also map the resilience of children's development into adulthood.
Yes.
And we can actually find what works well, what doesn't work well, and it helps direct where our services go best, I guess.
It's just, there's so much potential with this, and I think that's why we're both so excited about it.
Absolutely, and access some of the information that's these initial findings we'll post on the Learning Center. Have a look. They're really, really interesting, and keep this research study on your radar like we will. Because the findings, I think, will be incredibly life-changing.
Yeah.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you. Bye. Now let's have a listen to what Professor Carr had to say when we interviewed him after the seminar. Of the preliminary findings, were there any surprises for you and the team?
I think the biggest surprise I got was that the findings were very robust, rather more robust than I expected. For example, smoking during pregnancy was associated with greater likelihood of vulnerability at age 5, and that factor remained very significant, and even when we controlled for other variables such as socioeconomic status, preterm birth, referral or notification to family and community services. So it's a robust but small finding that has substantial significance at the population level, in that if we could eliminate maternal smoking during pregnancy, we would very likely improve profiles of vulnerability at age 5. Other findings that were of particular interest more or less confirmed what we expected, but the effects were much larger than had been anticipated, and these were in relation to abuse of in childhood and patterns of vulnerability at age 5. We found that neglect in particular and multiple forms of abuse were most strongly associated with psychological and cognitive vulnerability at age 5, and exceeded the contributions of other forms of abuse such as psychological abuse and violence. Now, this is an expected finding, but the magnitude of it was unexpected, in that these two forms of abuse, neglect and multiple abuses, have such an impact, especially if they are reported late rather than early in child development.
And how will information about the study be fed back to the community and policymakers over time?
Well, initially we had planned to publish our findings in the peer-reviewed literature, in the specialist literature, in other words, and we will certainly do that. But given the high level of community interest in our study at the present time, we have no alternative, I don't think, but to prepare information bulletins from time to time that we will most likely post on a website connected with the study that won't be available for at least a year from now, because we haven't developed the data analysis to a point at which we can do a sensible report of that kind. But I would expect within 12 to 18 months we'll have a website with regular bulletins as to the study findings.
I noticed you have a Facebook page too for those who like social media.
Yes, that's mostly connected with our survey that we're conducting next year, and we expect that to become very active later this year and early in 2015. But it's only just been established, and we'd be interested to know what people think.
Well, thank you very much for your time today.
You're welcome.